All morning Cert 3 community services. Just a little video. Maybe it's going to be a big video. Let's wait and see. Introducing a new topic, a new subject, work with diverse people, and this is the sort of stuff that we covered in week 1. So first off, we've got the little bit of the PowerPoints, but acknowledgement of country, we did speak about that at the start, and they've got the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flag there in front of you. A little bit about what culture could be, someone's heritage, which could be their worldview, their beliefs. It's something that draws a group together. A little slide there about what is culture. So behaviours that could be learned, shared, something learned and passed down, and the way we lead our lives. That's coming from a STARTS workbook. So STARTS being an organisation that works with refugees who've come to Australia, and in that process of escaping their land and arriving, or prior to arriving in Australia, they've usually experienced some trauma, perhaps even torture. There was a little activity that we didn't do in class, but I think it's something to reflect upon. It talks about drawing an image that in some way represents your culture or a culture that you identify with. And sometimes people struggle with that, thinking, I don't really feel like I've got a strong cultural belief. And I guess that's something we'll look at as we get into it. But it could be the sort of food we eat, religion, dress, language, traditions, ceremonies, celebrations and cultural values, spiritual beliefs and customs, or family structures and roles, gender relationships, age, and respect for the elderly. So I guess there's a little bit of cultural diversity. This little iceberg looks at, I guess, what we might see on the surface, the tip of the iceberg. We could see things like language, food, clothing. However, there's stuff that perhaps we don't necessarily see. We've got to dig deeper, or we sort of pick that up in our interactions with people, things like beliefs, attitudes, values and perceptions, and cultural norms. And I guess people coming to Australia trying to identify, beneath the surface, things that draw our culture together, and similarly, what we're learning from people who come and resettle in Australia. Perhaps there's some underlying stuff that might be different. Difference not, and I guess this subject's about not difference is not necessarily bad or evil, and that perhaps is the message we might get in the media from time to time, or other sources, even from the political sphere. Perhaps difference perhaps would be presented as something to be feared or worried about. However, I will present the idea that difference actually creates a better society, a more diverse, unique, stronger. So diversity should be seen as something that is a strength in a society, that if a society is diverse. And Australia now is under a guiding framework called the Multicultural Society, policy of multiculturalism. Name marginalised groups and 2 potential needs of these groups. So if you look at this brainstorming paper, we've got the exclusion in the centre, but how might, say, people who are in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex and asexual plus community may have experienced exclusion. And so we've got things there. Perhaps there's things like being not accepted in family in some cases, young people coming out perhaps with their sexuality, not feeling that they can come out and be accepted by family members. And we spoke about the issue of substance use, mental health issues amongst young, let's say, gay males as an example, not feeling fully supported. Could be how exclusion is manifested. So what's the need? So the need is good services in terms of counselling support, places like ACON, and it can maybe community education, things like the Mardi Gras help with that. Counselling services is mentioned there. Then the other group there, people living with a disability, and how they might have been excluded. So someone's written, say, autism-friendly places. So some people with autism, we spoke about shopping centres being noisy and busy, and then some shopping centres apparently create a quieter time through the day on certain days to ensure people with autism are able to shop without so much trauma, let's say. Let's say we've got accommodation services, so people with a disability may need specific support in their accommodation. It might need that. We've got NDIS funding, and that might be all intertwined in terms of that, supporting that accommodation. Maybe it's around employment support. Just a few little snapshots, and I'm just going to whiz through some of the others. So this one was trauma. So we've got children and women caught in domestic and family violence, so looking at the trauma there. And we've got refugees or culturally and linguistically diverse people who may be escaping particularly traumatic situations, perhaps things like civil war or unrest in a country. So trauma, so what are the needs? Again, it could be counselling, it could be financial aid, therapy, group therapy. We've got employment agencies, translation services, healthcare plans. So some really comprehensive list. What I will say, so we've got around the outside, we've got, say, women, children, we've got refugees. You could also interspace that or intertwine that with other groups, from people from the LGBTQIA plus group. We could look at trauma. People who are living with a disability. So we could have all sorts of different groups sitting around that. And also in the next one, so that the area was physical health care needs, and we've got aged frail there, so looking at what they might need from medical aids, GP, maybe transport. You could also put around that perhaps people with a disability. What are their physical health issues and needs? And it's going to be very similar, but perhaps slightly different. So as you see, although we haven't named every marginalised group in each heading in the middle, you can see that they're interchangeable, or you can add just about any group. Protective factors, so looking at what are the protective factors that people who are homeless might need. So it could be obviously crisis accommodation, Centrelink support, for example. And what about children and young people? So we have child protection legislation supported by DOCS and things like working with children's checks to make sure that people who are working with children and young people are not perpetrators of sexual abuse or violence against children. Just going to skim through these. The idea of negative attitudes. So we've just again randomly got a couple of groups, so First Nations people and people living in poverty. What are those negative attitudes out there? So perhaps people living in poverty in Department of Housing or Housing Commission areas, we're certainly aware of some of those stigma and the negative, lumping the negative attitudes onto some of those people, or onto that whole group of people. Similar to First Nations people, you've probably heard of those negative comments, sweeping comments about, First Nations people don't want to do this or can't do that, or etc., etc. And some of them, sometimes they might come through as jokes. Those negative attitudes. So what are the needs? So we've got education, so good education in schools, for example, that look at addressing some of those, let's say, the myths and replacing those with facts. Maybe it's particular housing support, could be specific employment programs, so getting a job. So there we go, people living in poverty, First Nations, but you could have also likewise said those negative attitudes could have been applied to another marginalised group like the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex plus community, or perhaps people with a disability. So it's totally interchangeable. But mental and emotional health care needs, so we've got people living with a mental health condition and or perhaps using alcohol and other drugs. So it could be GP support, access to a mental health care plan, counsellors, psychiatrists, specialist services, perhaps like hospitals, community education, breaking down the stigma. So there we go there, listed below. So in terms of political diversity, I mentioned that there are different parties, so I guess we're free to vote when we get to 18. For different political parties, we can change governments. Governments can have a different focus on how they manage the country, so that can be reflected. I guess being in a union or not is part of that diversity in a political sense, in that being in a union probably more aligns to a Labor government. And we also have the Greens in Australia, so putting the environment above other thinking. So the idea, how do we manage our environmental credentials or credibility versus, say, perhaps big business like mines? So there's a lot of different thinking there. How does it impact on our work and life? It impacts perhaps on what we watch on telly, what we listen to on radio, what we are exposed to on social media, even in terms of that political diversity. But in the end, we get a say on the society we want. Social diversity, so we've got people that are perhaps belonging to different groups, so you could be in an environmental group. Again, there's going to be a little bit of a overlap between some of these categories, political diversity and next one there, economic. But let's say social diversity, we might identify culturally with a different group, whether it be perhaps Indigenous, First Nations, or a different religious background, perhaps the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, stuff around gender. So how does that impact on us today? I guess, again, we're free to express ourselves as long as we're not being offensive. So we can go to work and identify as a First Nations person or someone who's come to Australia as a refugee. We should be able to participate fully in life and still access everything that we need. We shouldn't feel that we're going to be ridiculed or excluded. I guess our interactions with others, we can belong to a sports club, we could play soccer, we could do something else. Perhaps we want to be involved in the creative arts, drama, music. Maybe are we free to go out to a club these days or a pub? And I know we've just come through COVID, which has thrown things out differently. And I guess that was one of the issues with COVID, that people were, mental health was a bit more of a struggle when we're becoming more isolated and not having those social interactions. So what are those social interactions, I guess, as another way of looking at that social diversity and our impact on work and life. So pretty much we should be pretty free, although, from time to time we might read or hear stuff on social media that is not necessarily about inclusiveness, and it's about promoting one group over another and not necessarily making the other groups feel welcome. Economic diversity. We do see different spheres of wealth, if you like, different perhaps backgrounds, whether it's certain schools, perhaps gender might come into your thinking. So I think private schools, elite private schools, what sort of job you might end up with, where that might lead you. Perhaps that leads you into careers in law. Perhaps the stepping stone from law to politics is quite very easy pathway for some people. Maybe there are family connections. And what does that mean? Let's have a look at this little video from the movie Getting Square. That sort of probably tells the story.
Warren Halliwell, I'm asking you if you have ever heard of Warren Halliwell.
I told you, mate, I don't remember names and stuff like that. Oh. I do remember there was an old bloke, Warren, who used to drink at the Oxford at Petersham, but, mate, I don't know what his second name was.
I was referring to the accountant on the Gold Coast.
Well, you were referring Warren to an accountant?
No.
Oh, mate, old Warren wouldn't need an accountant, mate. He's just an old pisshead. I don't know where you're getting your info from. Oh, Warren would be dead by now, wouldn't he?
I am not talking about your friend from Petersham, Mr. Spiteri. I am talking about Warren Halliwell, the accountant, who practices on the Gold Coast.
Oh, yeah.
You know Warren Halliwell, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah, if he used to drink at the Oxford at Petersham, I do, yeah, mate. But Dad said he didn't look like an accountant to me.
No, I'm not saying he was an accountant.
Yes, you did. You said it then.
No.
Yes, you did, mate. Oh, you keep doing it. You're trying to confuse me. Anyway, what did old Warren do wrong, mate? What are you hassling him for? He's done nothing wrong. He's just an old pisshead.
I am not talking about your friend Warren.
Oh, well, what the fuck are you talking about? Oh, I gotta go home. My bus goes at 4 o'clock. Excuse me, who's paying for my bus fare today?
I put it to you that on August the 26th last year, you delivered approximately $200,000 in cash to the office of Warren Halliwell.
Oh, mate, 200? Do I look like I got 200 grand in cash? I'm on the bones of me ass, mate. Oh, I've got to get home. Who's paying for my bus fare today?
You don't need to worry about that now, witness.
Oh, excuse me, I am worried about it. I'm on medication, you know. Got to pick up my methadone before 5, otherwise I don't get nothing till the morning. Excuse me, Your Honour, do you know who's paying for my bus fare today?
Mr. Dent, has the witness been afforded appropriate expenses?
Sir, I'm informed those instructing me will arrange a cheque in payment of Mr. Spiteri's witness expenses directly.
A cheque? Well, what am I going to do with a cheque, Your Honour? I don't want a fucking cheque. Me bus driver's not going to take a cheque. I need me bus money, otherwise how am I supposed to get home?
Yes, all right, Mr. Spiteri. Mr. Dent, I wonder whether in the circumstances some appropriate arrangements couldn't be made.
To avoid further delays, I'll get Mr. Toole to fix that up now.
Oh, that's only $20. My bus doesn't come till 4. I'm going to need some lunch.
I think perhaps in the circumstances the witness is entitled to be reimbursed for his luncheon expenses, Mr. Dent.
I'll get Mr. Toole to give him another $20 to cover his luncheon expenses.
So getting square, guys, that certainly you can see some different social standings there, and whether that's something you think about, maybe that influences whether you play rugby league or rugby union off the top of my head. Hello there all you Cert 3s. I'm here at Glendale TAFE. Just over that way a little bit you'll find Cockle Creek. I think I'll get over there now. It's just a hop, skip and a jump away. Whoa, here I am up above beautiful Cockle Creek. Whoa! It's a bit windy today. I'm just going to swing around this way. Whoa! Yep, just down here. I'm just going to go and land down here and then I'll start talking to you. Whoa! Oh, bit of a rough landing. Ah, looks like I've landed in a different time. Looks like I'm here sometime before the 1970s. This ain't no disco. This ain't no fooling around. Oh, wow. Finally got here. What all this time travelling through times, I think I can make that relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So in terms of the diversity assessment, working with diverse people, I guess that idea of reflecting on where we've come from, the things that have impacted on who we are, forming our views. Remember that little activity we did at the start of when we introduced this unit, Jim and I, we got you to draw stuff, so the things that were important to you, flags to represent culture, foods, family, music, I think, media, things like that were mentioned. I guess going to reflect on what it was like for me in particular in the 70s and 80s, and I guess a big influence is media. So have a look at what was on television back then.
Tab Cola has a beautiful taste, so good for beautiful people. Tab Cola, beautiful to you and me, 'cause every can has less than 2 calories.
Look out, mouse.
Don't know if that works. Jim, how you going?
Yeah, good, how are you?
Yeah, good. Enjoying the serenity?
Beautiful, yeah. Look at this lake.
Given much thought to ads from the 70s or 80s lately?
Wow, they're amazing. I can sort of, doesn't seem that long ago. But, the old Solo Man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just went back to have a look, and I was actually a little bit surprised because I guess living in that moment, you don't really think about it. But going back, certainly for the soft drinks, you know, I guess how much every soft drink ad was about, you know, sex selling in a sense, particularly the portrayal of the female body.
Absolutely, yeah. It's it's like that idea of the perfect image.
Definitely.
And I'm always curious. Like I think I'm curious to know, like, has it really changed that much? Thinking maybe things aren't that different nowadays. That there's still sort of this certain image.
Yeah. I guess my initial thought was, oh, maybe it is different today. It's not as blatant or in your face. But then I started thinking about, if I look at the glossy mags, for example, if I go to Coles, there's still a big focus on, you know, perfect bodies, male and female. Doesn't matter what the magazine is. Yeah.
I think for guys particularly now, there's much more about being that macho fella.
So the solo man might have started it all, but
from solo man to norm back to solo man.
Certainly some of those eating disorders type things, I would imagine. I'll have to check this out. But, you know, from the 70s and 80s, and they continue to be there and still a big issue. So
I think that with the 70s and 80s, I don't know if it's still now, but I know growing up myself, you weren't exposed to a lot of diversity. I think nowadays maybe there is a bit more diversity because people have got the ability to tell their story or to share stuff via social media, particularly. It's so accessible. But I still think, even with all that diversity and those different stories, there's still this, I think there is still this mainstream or this particular image that the majority of people kind of aspire to a bit.
That dominant way of, I guess, shaping
and seeing the world, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that's still true. I think
so. Even though it's different with social media, and I'm not an expert, and I'm sure some of you guys are, but you mentioned Instagram, and how would I say, it's different, but perhaps similar or even the same.
Same but different, as they
yeah,
say in Asia.
Different. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the challenge for everyone here with doing this assessment that we're doing, this is very much when you're coming to do the reflection, you've asked to sort of consider in your reflection the views of broader community. So broader community, let's call it mainstream community. And I think all those ads from the 70s and the 80s and a lot of the stuff we still see on Instagram now, today in 2020, that's what they kind of mean by mainstream broader community. So is there still that kind of dominant view, and how those views somehow different or perhaps consistent with the group that you guys are going to be researching and presenting on? You know, whether it be disabilities, is somehow disabilities now the image of disabilities in 2020? Does society generally see it as being, you know, people with disabilities as being more, people are more accepting of them, celebrating more their abilities? Are we doing that, or are we still?
I guess what word that comes to mind from those ads from the 70s, 80s, it's a whitewashed view of the world. So, you know, everyone was very white, in a sense.
White and almost perfect.
Almost perfect.
Nothing wrong with them.
Totally perfect. There was certainly no disability or an Aboriginal person or Torres Strait Islander person. I don't think was anywhere to be seen or mentioned as examples of that whitewashed view of the world.
And I think that's where maybe 2020 mainstream or broader media is a bit different. We're hearing different stories, but I think that's because, take with Aboriginal people themselves, they've got access to creating those stories and control over telling those stories now, much more. But I'm curious to think whether even those stories that they're telling are non-Indigenous people listening to them. Are they becoming more aware, for instance, of some of the challenges that Indigenous people face? Or is it still something that's just like NITV? Who watches NITV? Do you spend time watching NITV? Because that's where a lot of Indigenous stories or Aboriginal stories within Australia live.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's certainly a change in that sense. So there's more diversity out there. Are people engaging with it? Are you engaging and looking into that from that diverse group, other diverse groups' perspective?
Perspective's an interesting one, because I know we've talked a bit about the idea that you know, we all have a particular way of looking at the world that's been shaped by our own upbringing. And it's funny because I grew up, those ads from the 70s, I was going into my teenage years. So I was shaped by them and my view of the world. You know, you can't deny that. But I don't think it was until I was about 23 and ended up going to uni that someone put in front of me a different view of the world and challenged me. And I went, wow, I never thought of that before. It doesn't mean that I forget my own values and beliefs and how I was brought up. They're really important to me, but it's good to be challenged to see the world differently. Because I think in community services particularly, you're going to be working with people from a whole range of different backgrounds who've been brought up differently with different values and beliefs to yourself. And you know, you've got to remain true to you and yourself and your values and beliefs, but you're going to be challenged by some of their values and beliefs. It's really important to be aware of how mainstream media and other media might shape your own values and beliefs, how family might, how school might, popular media, music, movies, politics.
We've got our leaders telling us stuff.
So being aware of how that all makes you, but...
so you'll develop your own view of the world.
Your own view of the world.
Yeah. Not that it's not a wrong view of the world. It's about, I guess, be mindful that there are influences that create that, what we see as perhaps more correct view of the world.
That's right. Be aware that, you know, we're told a certain correct view, but, you know, your view is not right or wrong. But what is wrong is for you to go and impose your view of the world onto those people that you're supporting.
Yeah, because they'll have their own stories.
They'll have their own stories.
And their own influences, perhaps. And there might be subtle differences within family or even socioeconomics, perhaps, or other subtleties, or coming from another country or culture that's very different. So they'll have their own view of the world. So by us imposing one view, this view is the correct view and the only view, that's where we'll...
Got to be careful.
That's where we'll get in trouble.
That's where we've got to be really mindful of Our own worldview.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming along this evening, and I would also like to extend my respects to my Gadigal brothers and sisters from my people, the Wiradjuri people. In the winter of 2015, Australia turned to face itself. It looked into its soul and it had to ask this question: who are we? What sort of country do we want to be? And this happened in a place that is most holy, most sacred to Australians. It happened on the sporting field, it happened on the football field. Suddenly the front page was on the back page, it was in the grandstands. Thousands of voices rose to hound an Indigenous man, a man who was told he was an Australian, a man who was told he was an Australian of the Year. And they hounded that man into submission. I can't speak for what lay in the hearts of the people who booed Adam Goodes, but I can tell you what we heard when we heard those boos. We heard a sound that was very familiar to us. We heard a howl. We heard a howl of humiliation that echoes across 2 centuries of dispossession, injustice, suffering, and survival. We heard the howl of the Australian dream, and it said to us again, "You're not welcome." The Australian dream. We sing of it and we recite it in verse. Australians all, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. My people die young in this country. We die 10 years younger than average Australians, and we are far from free. We are fewer than 3% of the Australian population, and yet we are 25%, a quarter of those Australians, locked up in our prisons. And if you are a juvenile, it is worse, it is 50%. An Indigenous child is more likely to be locked up in prison than they are to finish high school. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges. Reminds me that my people were killed on those plains. We were shot on those plains. Disease ravaged us on those plains. I come from those plains. I come from a people west of the Blue Mountains, the Wiradjuri people, where in the 1820s the soldiers and settlers waged a war of extermination against my people. Yes, a war of extermination. That was the language used at the time. Go to the Sydney Gazette and look it up and read about it. Martial law was declared and my people could be shot on sight. Those rugged mountain ranges, my people, women and children, were herded over those ranges to their deaths. The Australian dream. The Australian dream is rooted in racism. It is the very foundation of the dream. It is there at the birth of the nation. It is there in terra nullius, an empty land, a land for the taking. 60,000 years of occupation. A people who made the first seafaring journey in the history of mankind. A people of law, a people of lore, L-O-R-E, a people of music and art and dance and politics. None of it mattered because our rights were extinguished because we were not here according to British law. And when British people looked at us, they saw something subhuman, and if we were human at all, we occupied the lowest rung on civilization's ladder. We were fly-blown Stone Age savages, and that was the language that was used. Charles Dickens, the great writer of the age, when referring to the noble savage of which we were counted among, said it would be better that they be wiped off the face of the earth. Captain Arthur Phillip, a man of enlightenment, a man who was instructed to make peace with the so-called natives in a matter of years, was sending out raiding parties with the instruction, bring back the severed heads of the black troublemakers. They were smoothing the dying pillow. My people were rounded up and put on missions from where, if you escaped, you were hunted down, you were roped and tied and dragged back. And it happened here. It happened on the mission that my grandmother and my great-grandmother are from at Warringezda on the Darling Point at the Murrumbidgee River. Read about it. It happened. By 1901, when we became a nation, when we federated the colonies, we were nowhere. We're not in the Constitution, save for race provisions, which allowed for laws to be made that would take our children, that would invade our privacy, that would tell us who we could marry and tell us where we could live, the Australian dream. By 1963, the year of my birth, the dispossession was continuing. Police came at gunpoint, under cover of darkness, to Mapoon, an Aboriginal community in Queensland, and they ordered people from their homes, and they burned those homes to the ground, and they gave the land to a bauxite mining company, and today those people remember that as the night of the burning. In 1963, when I was born, I was counted among the flora and fauna, not among the citizens of this country. Now, you will hear things tonight, you will hear people say, but you've done well. Yes, I have. And I'm proud of it. And why have I done well? I've done well because of who has come before me. My father, who lost the tips of 3 fingers working in sawmills to put food on our table because he was denied an education. My grandfather, who served to fight wars for this country when he was not yet a citizen and came back to a segregated land where he couldn't even share a drink with his digger mates in the pub because he was black. My great-grandfather, who was jailed for speaking his language to his grandson, my father, jailed for it. My grandfather on my mother's side, who married a white woman who reached out to Australia, lived on the fringes of town until the police came, put a gun to his head, bulldozed his tin humpy and ran over the graves of the 3 children he buried there. That's the Australian dream. I have succeeded in spite of the Australian dream, not because of it, and I have succeeded because of those people. You might hear tonight, but you have white blood in you. And if the white blood in me was here tonight, my grandmother, she would tell you of how she was turned away from a hospital giving birth to her first child because she was giving birth to the child of a black person. The Australian dream. We're better than this. I have seen the worst of the world as a reporter. I spent a decade in war zones from Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are an extraordinary country. We are in so many respects the envy of the world. If I was sitting here where my friends are tonight, I would be arguing passionately for this country. But I stand here with my ancestors and the view looks very different from where I stand. The Australian dream. We have our heroes. Albert Namatjira painted the soul of this nation. Vincent Lingiari put his hand out for Gough Whitlam to pour the sand of his country through his fingers and say, "This is my country." Kathy Freeman lit the torch to the Olympic Games, but every time we are lured into the light, we are mugged by the darkness of this country's history. Of course racism is killing the Australian dream. It is self-evident that it's killing the Australian dream. But we are better than that. The people who stood up and supported Adam Goodes and said no more, they are better than that. The people who marched across the bridge for reconciliation, they are better than that. The people who supported Kevin Rudd when he said sorry to the stolen generations, they are better than that. My children and their non-Indigenous friends are better than that. My wife, who is non-Indigenous, is better than that. And one day I want to stand here and be able to say as proudly and sing as loudly as anyone else in this room, Australians all, let us rejoice. Thank you.
It's clear our politics doesn't treat women equally, and it's clear from our history that race determines your future. So how do you fix a broken, unequal world where the divide is only getting bigger? Welcome to Q&A. Hey there, welcome to the program. Joining me on the panel tonight, author Bruce Pascoe, who's speaking on climate change at Melbourne's Wheeler Centre this Sunday. Economist at the University of New South Wales, Gigi Foster, is here. Economics editor at The Australian, Adam Crichton. President of Chief Executive Women, Sam Mostyn. Journalist and author, Stan Grant. And joining us shortly from Paris, internationally renowned economist Thomas Piketty, who's just written a new book, Capital and Ideology. Please make all of them feel welcome. And I should say that if that's not enough for you, Dami Im is here to close the show for us tonight. Hi there, Dami. And as always, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Our first question tonight comes from Kirsten Nielsen.
Thanks, Hamish. In a recent press conference, Scott Morrison said that he believes in all the women of Australia. This is despite for months broadly dismissing and ignoring the allegations of sexual assault and harassment made by women from within the Parliament. Scott Morrison went on to concede in an interview yesterday that blokes don't always get it right all the time, and now finds himself at the centre of a political storm. My question to the panel is whether we are to believe that Scott Morrison is genuinely committed to this issue, or are these the words of a politician scrambling to find his way out of a messy predicament, largely of his own making?
Sam Mostyn.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. It's the question of our time, isn't it? And I notice you're here with a young woman as well, slightly younger than my daughter, and these questions have been plaguing all of us, not just this week, but in the months and years that we've been experiencing just a general lack of equality, and then a whole lot of really nasty things that have been happening in the place that's meant to set the tone for the country, in Parliament House. So it disturbs me to hear a Prime Minister saying that it's taken all of this into these last few days to suddenly work these things out. But what it does tell me is that it's only environments where you have lots of women in power and alongside men that get to observe these things at close range to actually see what's going on. And in my experience over 30 years in many big organisations, a lot of men start by saying that it's taken a long time to work that out because they've been up there by themselves with other groups of men, and any homogenous group can't work out what's happening around it because they don't have the eyes or the antenna to tell you what's been going wrong. So I'm hoping that it's got so bad that the Prime Minister does really care. There are many things he could be doing right now, his government could be doing right now, that would tell us that he cares. He could accept Kate Jenkins' 55 recommendations to make all of our workplaces safer. He could be shuffling his cabinet to make sure there are lots of women that are in very senior positions.
Do you believe him, though, that he gets it?
I think he's got it politically. I think this has been a week where everything has come together, whether it's been...
But that's a different thing. Does he fundamentally get this issue?
I think he gets it now. I think he gets how horrific... I think what was the most disturbing thing for the Prime Minister were those gross acts by young men inside Parliament House that said they completely disrespected women who chose to be MPs. At that point, I think the Prime Minister really did get it because it was such an affront. But for women, I'm sure the women in the audience and watching tonight, we're so used to these kind of behaviours that we've been getting it for a very, very long time. And we're looking for men and women in leadership that actually say to us, enough's enough, as all of the rallies did around the country. Men and women called for this change and enough is enough. But they also said that we've got to start respecting women. There's a fundamental primary reason why these things happen, and it's a lack of respect for us. It's our failure to have been allowed through the corridors of power and to be in equal numbers, running things, leading things, and we've been kept at bay. And that's why I think it came as such a surprise, because I don't think the Prime Minister's had experience really of a community and a parliament that has women in equal numbers.
Adam Crichton, how did you see those rallies?
Well, look, the March for Justice, I thought... I was actually in Melbourne last week for it, actually, and I walked past it, and I must say there were so many placards which were really anti-Scott Morrison rather than, pro-woman. I thought it was a very political march. And the other thought that came to mind is, what is the tangible aim of those people who are marching? I mean, if you go back 120 years, obviously women wanted the vote, and certainly they should have got it. Many decades later, there was abortion. But what is justice this time? It's like, it's like marching for happiness. I mean, it's, of course everyone wants it, but what is the tangible outcome?
It was pretty clear, wasn't it? I mean,
yes, but what can the federal government do about attitudes? It's the Commonwealth government. It can't legislate for people to be nice, right? It just can't. And no matter what the Prime Minister says, no matter what platitudes he utters, it's not going to change people's attitudes. That's up to civil society.
That's what great leadership is all about. Tone from the top. The Prime Minister of the country going out...
Most people don't pay any attention,
do you know what would have made all the
attention to what the Prime Minister says.
No, they do.
No,
they absolutely.
Only the political class does. People here do, but most
people have been paying attention to the Prime Minister's behaviour, which has been keeping women down for the last couple of years. I think those people have got very comfortable with the kind of things that have been happening to women, and suddenly we all had enough. That's why the marches took place. But the thing the Prime Minister could have done...
When you say we, though, I mean, it's only 100,000 or so women who marched. It's not all women who marched.
I think
it's bad to tarnish all men with... with the same brush.
But we don't tarnish all men with the same brush. That's not what's going on here.
That's the implication. Men are half the population. Women are half the population. There are good and bad people in both groups. And
so we're more than half the population, and we have been held at bay. We are murdering a woman once a week in this country, and have been doing that for many, many years. What would it take to get a community and the top of our parliament to say, we get that we've got to change the behaviour, both of our parliaments, of our leaders, to actually listen to women? All women wanted in that rally, and the men, was to be listened to. And then I'm actually certain that if the Prime Minister and his Cabinet had gone out onto the forecourt of Parliament House, I don't think they would have been booed. No one else from the Parliament that went out was booed. I think they would have actually been asked to listen to all those speakers and then to listen to Brittany Higgins explain what it's like to be a survivor of an alleged rape metres away from the Prime Minister's office.
Just to be clear, I'm obviously not condoning any of the things that went on. They are shocking, they are awful, and they should be prosecuted and sacked, and kind of depending on the allegation. But we just have to keep things in proportion.
But did you get the sense, though, that this was the moment when almost every woman in the country felt every part of those things that had been going on had happened to them in some part of their life, and suddenly
almost every woman in the country? How do you know that? I mean, that's just
Stan Grant,
should we do it?
Stan Grant, how did you observe what's going on in Canberra right now?
There are a couple of things, and I think Adam has a point to this extent, that protests do not always indicate mood and do not always presage political change. Remember the Vietnam moratoriums, the biggest protests Australia's probably ever seen. 250,000 people out constantly. The Holt government at the time was returned with an increased majority. We saw 200,000 people walk across the bridge for reconciliation. John Howard would not say sorry. John Howard was returned to office time and time again. I don't know that political movements necessarily translate to that political change or that mood. Another point I would make, though, and I think this is something that has been very apparent to me, is that as necessary and as urgent and as righteous as these claims are, and this movement is, there have been so many women's voices who have not been listened to for a long time. And I just want to say, when it becomes a white middle-class issue, when it is in private schools, when it is in Parliament House, when it is in the press gallery, we take notice. But when Aboriginal women who have been suffering domestic violence rates 40 times higher than the rest of the population, 10 times more likely to die as a result of that violence. When I have seen Aboriginal women marching and protesting and calling for support for generations, I did not see the same women outside Parliament House. When poor women, when migrant women, when refugee women have suffered these things, I did not see the same media attention. Poor women don't get interviewed on television programs. They're not on Q&A. There are a lot of voices that are not listened to here, and I think while this is a movement and a moment, we need to also reflect on our own blindness and our biases, that we can walk past the suffering of others for such a long time until it lands in your own backyard.
I think you're absolutely right to make that point. It was a point made last week on the consent panel you had here by Joe Williams, who pointed out where does consent and where did the breach of consent start, and it was at the very beginning of the colonies, and he made a very powerful point, as you have too, Stan. It's not to say, though, that if those mistakes have been made and that those women have not been listened to in the past, that this isn't the moment when we all unite and where we have to listen. And I think many of those women, migrant women, women who are on temporary visas, women who have been decimated by the lack of respect for their allegations, whether it's sexual harassment or sexual assault or worse, they came together. And whenever I go to large groups of women now, with a lot of the women you've described, a lot of Indigenous women, a lot of recently arrived migrants, and we talk about the anger that is sitting in the pits of our stomachs, the anger, the fury and the sadness, I think we're drawing on a number of those women's experiences.
What a shame it is, Sam, that a nation reveals what it is by what it cares about. And what a shame it is that it has to happen in white middle-class society for people to suddenly say there is a massive problem here. And it's been happening, as you well know, in factory floors, in homes, for Aboriginal women. And, you know, as Joe pointed out last week, when a nation is built on theft, invasion, massacre and rape, you then wonder now why you have a culture and a society that reflects some of these attitudes. So, of course it's important, Sam, and of course this is a moment, but there have been so many voices not heard and not listened to, and still sadly not on this panel tonight, Hamish.
Hello everyone, Insert 3. Welcome to At the Movies with David and hello, I'm Margaret. During this time of self-isolation, we're hoping that you might have more time to watch a few videos helpful to the assignment that we're looking at now, the diversity, working with diverse people. So we're going to do a little review on a few mostly short videos that we think could be a good starting point if you haven't quite known where to start yet. Yes, David, I couldn't agree more. While people are self-isolating, this is a great opportunity to have a look at some short videos in most cases that are, I think, educational and entertaining and insightful. The first video I'm going to recommend comes from the ABC series Employable Me, in particular the episode that has the young fellow called Kaya as one of the main stars of this production. Kaya I find very fascinating. He's a young fellow dealing with Tourette's, but also uses Auslan to communicate. Although he's not a deaf, he's used Auslan, he's learnt Auslan, and that could be a pathway to employment for Kaya. But it is very insightful in terms of cultural groups, yeah, whether it's around Tourette's or Auslan and the deaf community, or a bit of both. Yes, Margaret, but the fascinating thing is how Kaya, not really being a part of the deaf community, uses Auslan and is accepted, and it's a way for him to find a group that he finds his place in the world with, and his other issues of swearing with his Tourette's, which can be socially awkward, does not really come into play.
Finding the right job can be hard for anyone.
How many jobs would you say you've applied for?
Definitely over 100. Chinese slingshot.
Different.
Damn it. Your mum is on eBay.
If I was to do something more, we'd be off the charts.
And battle to overcome challenges.
China!
Yes, David, it is a marvellous introduction to the deaf community and Auslan and Tourette's. Also, what's really good in this video, you get insight in some of the services that are out there working in this space. But in the end, David, it's a great production, and I give it 5 stars out of 5. Another series that I highly recommend is the one entitled You Can't Ask That. This is a fascinating insight into the lives of people who identify with different groups in the community, groups such as people in Australia who arrived as refugees, intersex, people living with autism. There's a recent one, Indigenous Australians. So getting the voice from those people it's a really good starting point.
We ready?
Ready when you are.
Do you have a dick and vagina, or ovaries and balls, or another combination?
I have another combination. What have doctors done to try and fix you up?
That's a really big question, that one.
Can you have normal sex?
I hate the word normal.
It's confusing. So, are you transgender?
I really do detest being called an it.
What is intersex? Are you a hermaphrodite?
Bang right onto the target.
Okay, so firstly, hermaphrodite's considered a bit of a slur for intersex people.
It was a word that was used to describe us, but there was a misunderstanding about what that actually means.
Hermaphrodite means consisting of both sexes at the same time, so like in snails.
It's out there, it's just not really seen or heard or spoken about.
Wow.
Oh. Ah! Yay!
Oh yes, David, I really think it's worth it to search the link and have a look at the different productions of You Can't Ask That series. I think it's possibly up to 6 series now, so there are many, many groups that this series focuses on. Highly recommended this, David, and I give it 5 stars. It's goodbye from me. Thank you, Margaret, yes, and then it's also good day from me from the movie show. And Turtle Pips. Okay, here we go, Cert 3, another little video to help with the assessment, the knowledge for work with diverse people. So we're up to question 5. Question A, 5A, in what situation would you use a language and cultural interpreters and provide a real example? So in class we spoke about the use of an interpreter, perhaps working with someone from a non-English speaking background. You might be meeting them for the first time, going out perhaps even a home visit, and there would be a need for an interpreter to understand what that person was wanting, requiring, needing. 5B, when would you use imagery? And we did speak about a few examples. One in particular comes to mind with perhaps sexual health education with young people with a intellectual disability, and there were some really good visual resources available from Family Planning New South Wales on their website, and we did have a look at those. And there's a few other examples. Pictures, flip charts, or sometimes called flip charts, or picture books, or sometimes called Compics, to help people with or young people was the example, with a learning disability or an intellectual disability of some sort of developmental disability, and so to communicate their needs, they would point to particular pictures. So it could be perhaps using the bathroom or needing some food, water, as examples, and they'd have appropriate pictures to point to. So there is a couple of examples for 5. Number 6 and 3, changing cultural practices in Australia. The first one we spoke about was the inclusion of people with a disability in Australian society or Australian community, and I guess the changing practices. We think back or research back into the 70s, 1970s, early 80s and prior to that, and the approach would have been a larger institution in many cases, and people were segregated and kept away from society. Inclusiveness within your workplace. Give 2 examples how you value and respect diversity and inclusiveness in your work. It could be about being respectful of people, using their appropriate name or pronoun if you're working with people from who are perhaps in that transitioning community, transgender. That would be respectful. Would be having those open conversations with a colleague, perhaps a colleague from a different cultural background, and making sure that you're understanding the appropriateness around things like personal space or gestures or touch even. Explain how you contribute to the development of workplace and professional relationships based on appreciation of diversity and inclusiveness. That's in the professional sense, so that could be things like attending meetings and training, workplace training around inclusiveness, cross-cultural practice. It could be making efforts to get a guest speaker or guest presenter at a staff meeting, someone who's from a different cultural background or a different cultural group, to provide some sort of group cultural training. So you might initiate that. That would show your professional commitment to inclusiveness and diversity in the workplace. Identify 2 workplace practices that make environments safe for all. So that could be participating in workplace inspections, and particularly in making sure that workplaces are safe. People with a physical disability and may have access challenges, perhaps using a wheelchair. It could be about using appropriate documentation to report WHS issues, and doing that in a respectful and appropriate person-centred language. So D, what strategies do you use to ensure you show respect when communicating with people from diverse backgrounds? So again, the LGBTQIA+ community, it could be things like using the appropriate pronoun or the preferred name that people want to be known by. It could be about appropriate body language, eye contact, different space, maybe gender differences between cultures, and respecting that. Could be about asking people would they prefer to see a male or a female perhaps when they're talking to staff. As I got older, certainly into high school, there would be the negative attitudes and talk around the LGBTQIA+ community, where that stem from. I guess things like jokes, comments, put downs. Certainly exposed to that, and so yeah, you get that framework that's not okay, and how that impacted on me personally. Yeah, things like, I guess if you're questioning your sexual identity and concerns as a 13-year-old, and so that sort of reflects people who do identify back then perhaps as gay, as an example, and then having to stay in the closet, so to speak, not being able to come out. So there's a fair bit of discussion in that video about reflecting and what that means. So if you're a worker and you've not reflected on your cultural background or learned about other cultural backgrounds, what could happen in your communication? So I guess primarily you might say stuff that's offensive, make comments, remarks that are derogatory to other groups, other diverse groups, whether they be from a cultural background, sexually diverse background, as two examples. Perhaps you're not able to recognise discrimination so easily, and whether that's across gender, culture, ethnicity, age, etc. Identify 2 ways to improve your self and social awareness. Well, certainly thinking about it, perhaps doing some education and training, cross-cultural courses, reflecting on the attitudes and values and where they've come from and those influences. You should be able to reflect on your own biases and attitudes and behaviours and be able to learn others, and then be able to be more mindful about behaving in a culturally appropriate way. Understanding that you have your own ideas and views and checking that they're based in, I guess, orality and not just on, I guess, popular culture, whether it's social media or negative comments or stereotypes that you might be exposed to, and those perceptions are, you've got to just check that your perceptions are not skewed or biased, and that's not leading your behaviour and your interactions with others. Social expectations, yeah, we did spend a bit of time looking at that as well, and I guess certain groups, there might be negative expectations in a sense, or things that you may have experienced or seen firsthand that are negative. But being able to move beyond that, if you're working with those people from those disadvantaged groups. We spoke about young people perhaps in social housing or disadvantaged communities who may be out late at night and doing negative things, or, you know, making you cranky when you go to fill up petrol at the servo and they give you a gobful, perhaps something like that. So maybe there's a set of social expectations around certain groups that are negative, and so if you're able to see the bigger picture, that there's also experiences in those people's lives that might explain some of that behaviour, whether it's parents with a disability or low social options like employment, disadvantage, poverty, and then those people perhaps feel trapped or disempowered, and to get power back maybe it comes out through poor behaviour. But I guess if we're trying to build a relationship, we've got to see beyond the negative behaviour, see the person first, and try and engage and work with the positives and the strengths. So being mindful of those negative social expectations, I think, is where we ended up there. Also, perhaps looking at working with an Aboriginal person, perhaps an older male coming to your service, and you know that person is an elder. We spoke about the respectfulness use of the term uncle or auntie for females, but we had a little bit of discussion about my information of recent years was that, yeah, Aboriginal people who are elders are quite okay with a non-Aboriginal person calling them uncle or auntie, seeing that as a sign of respect. Maybe in that case, if you're working with an Aboriginal fellow, perhaps greeting them with uncle, hello uncle, acknowledging that they may be uncomfortable coming to a welfare service, given that there's been some problematic histories in the past, and that may, you know, have intergenerational trauma impacts, so stolen generations, for example, and if we're in some sort of welfare role, we might be viewed with mistrust, and acknowledging that up front, and acknowledging that if we can try and find an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander worker, if that would be more appropriate, and seeking whether that would be something that the uncle would be happy with, just some examples, yeah, and just be mindful of. 11, we spoke about the relationship with human needs and human rights. And human needs, we spoke about Maslow, the hierarchy of needs. Down the bottom of that hierarchy are things like food, shelter, water, sex, I think, is down that bottom layer, and then human rights being, for me, human rights will be enshrined in some sort of legislation, whether it's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the rights of the child, or more localised laws around inclusion and diversity and non-discrimination. But in a sense, those laws are about upholding a person's needs. But that might mean, you know, the need is food and shelter, and, you know, the right to get some sort of housing could be enshrined in law, some sort of emergency housing, doing the best to meet people's basic needs, enshrined through our laws, our human rights laws. So, yeah, what do we need to survive, and how do we ensure that it happens, that interrelationship between human needs and human rights. Feel that you have. Give 2 examples of social, political and economic issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and that they may experience. Okay, so I'm just going to try and finish a little bit quicker here, guys. This has gone fair time. I think reflect back to the lyrics from Archie Roach. Took the children away as a starting point. Think about that history and the complicated history. That's a snapshot from the stolen generations worth thinking about and how that plays out today. Also refer to information. Have a Google, have a look at the Closing the Gap report. See what information is in there. That will give you a snapshot of some of those types of issues. And there is also a part B to that question, and it talks about listing 2 impacts these issues may have on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to accessing services. So again, the Archie Roach lyrics give a good insight into some of the issues around accessing services from a historical but also current perspective in some of those social issues, the history, the exclusion, so the negative thoughts, the worries, perhaps the health issues, whether that be mental health, physical health, which is all outlined in the Closing the Gap report. So too is the economic issues. So if you're living in poverty, unemployment, chronic health issues, as an example, you may be less likely to be able to even access services. You could be living in a remote area where there are poor services, perhaps, and some of those cultural issues in that last part of the question, cultural barriers. And I guess perhaps culture could be seen as the different ways of viewing the world, so the different solutions. And I might just pose the question, which we did raise in class, how often or into what extent are Aboriginal people really asked or listened to by decision makers in what they think are the solutions to some of these issues as a closing point. And I'll finish too. There'll be a little clip at the end.
Imagine a line of well-being. You have ups and downs, and that's normal. Before colonisation, Aboriginal people also had their ups and downs, but overall our spirit was strong. Aboriginal people had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. When the dominant culture arrived and they took over our land without our permission, the process of dispossession began. The loss of land and disruption to our way of life, ignoring the things most sacred to our culture, including our family kinship systems, language, traditional law, cultural practices, and looking after country. The dispossession brought massacres, poisoning, and disease. We lost our freedom, physical safety, and health, all of which impacted on our well-being. They introduced legislation and policies to assimilate us, with the ultimate aim to breed Aboriginal people out of existence. They even took our children from us. We lost the right to move freely in our own country and to see our family. We did not have access to legal systems. We were not allowed to get an equal education or receive equal health care. They took half our earnings and we had to get permission to marry. Our basic human rights were denied. All of this pain and loss can break your spirit. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what colour your skin is or how civilised you think you are, if people no longer have those basic human rights, their well-being will plummet. And this is exactly what happened to us as Aboriginal people. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation suffered. Despite all of this, Aboriginal people endured, and through the resilience of our spirit, we survived. Slowly, policies and practices began to change, and the journey of our recovery begins. But it's not an easy thing to overcome, and many of our people are still living in a place of despair and hurt. When you are oppressed on such a large scale and for so long, a lot of despair builds up. Eventually, you start to normalise that. This is how it is for our people. The oppression has become internalized. When people go through trauma, they often rely on their family and friends to be the strong rocks that support them and help them to recover. But what happens when everyone around you is also going through the same trauma? Those rocks that you try to hold on to pull yourself up are also crumbling. And like all human beings, what we don't heal in our own lives, we sometimes pass on to our children. When there is internalized oppression and low well-being for generation after generation, along with a society that views you with negative stereotypes, racism and prejudices, it may lead to family violence, alcohol and drug use, incarceration, illness, mental health issues, and low emotional and social well-being, even suicide. Children who are born into this environment might not always have the same opportunities and may start to view the world as harsh and cold instead of feeling love, warmth and security. This is called intergenerational trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, our people are strong and resilient, and there are plenty of us living happy and healthy lives with strong connection to our families, community and culture. But many of us have family and friends who are struggling, and when we try to help pull them out, it can be very easy for us to get pulled back in. Let's think about the economy for a moment. The white man comes to our country, and with them, they bring a whole new social and economic system. Our people were stopped from doing things our way, even though it had been working well for us for a long time. Yet we were also locked out of the new systems. This systematic exclusion from the economy and social systems throughout multiple generations has led to the many disparities in the social determinants of well-being that our people are challenged with today. Over time, there have been other cultures that have migrated to Australia, who have also been subjected to discriminatory legislation, like the White Australia policy. They too have experienced racism and discrimination. However, unlike our people, they were allowed to stay together, keep their children, maintain their cultural ways, and participate in the economy. Whereas our mob has only been allowed to participate in the last 40 to 50 years. As we can see, it's a big and complex challenge that we are facing. Even after the policies of colonisation ended, the trauma of these policies and practices still echo down the generations. I'm not talking about ancient history either. Some people say, it happened 200 years ago, get over it. Sure, the oppression may have started 200 years ago, but it has only started to change recently, less than 50 years ago. The last of the 1905 Act was only repealed in 1964 and the Native Welfare Act in 1972. So when were your parents born? When were you born? Many people living today are survivors of those oppressive legislations. The struggle to heal communities and achieve self-determination and equity takes time. The impacts of past policies are still felt today. And now we live in a contemporary society, but there are new policies and legislation that still impact negatively on Aboriginal people. We also need to change society's negative stereotypes and attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Participating in modern Australia shouldn't mean that we have to forget our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. We know that strengthening, reclaiming and reviving our culture and language builds our resilience and is healing for our people. Many of our mob are healing and living strong and healthy lives with a strong connection to our culture. We can still go hunting. We just might use a four-wheel drive to get there and be using the latest fishing rod instead of a spear. We can still have a strong spiritual connection to our country and the land. We can still speak our language, sing and dance, have ceremonies, paint our pictures and pass our stories to our young ones. we can still respect our elders, share tucker with our family and loved ones, and care for our kin. We can maintain our cultural and social obligations to family, community and country, and be respected as the first people of this nation. We can live and thrive in modern Australia as equals. That's what Aboriginal wellbeing is. So how long does it take for people to recover from this trauma and the lasting effects of colonisation and dispossession? Well, we actually do have some idea. Because unfortunately, people have been oppressing each other and inflicting trauma on each other's cultures all around the world for centuries. The evidence tells us that the impacts of trauma on the individual may be felt for many generations after the initial trauma. So if we know that on an individual level the trauma impacts on future generations, what are the effects of the trauma inflicted on a whole race of people for multiple generations? We can assume that it might take a lot longer to recover. But our people's spirit is strong, and we are recovering. However, it is important to remember that right now in Australia, we are smack in the middle of a transition phase. We know that recovering from colonisation and dispossession is a process that takes time. But through engagement, partnerships, and systemic change to attitudes and policies, we can speed this process up. What does this mean? It means recognition of Aboriginal people as the first people of this nation, engagement and partnerships to support Aboriginal-led community-controlled initiatives, building sustainability through increased education and workforce opportunities, addressing the social disparities and providing equitable access to services, ensuring that there is a broader understanding of Aboriginal culture and history in schools, universities and workplaces, providing culturally safe services that challenge racism, systemic bias and stereotypes, recognition and support for cultural strengths that contribute to well-being, helping to maintain, reclaim and revive Aboriginal culture and language. Strengthen Aboriginal people's basic human right of self-determination and equity. And sharing the vision of all Aboriginal people living long, well and healthy lives.